Really delighted today to welcome someone I've known for a very long time onto the show to share some sage advice. I was thinking before this session, when I first met this person, I think it was actually in a meeting talking with and sort of feeding into a conversation around education, and something that struck me from the get-go was that this person always put the kids right at the front of his thinking, which for me, vision and values-wise, really resonated. And it's been a real pleasure to have Chris Edwards, that's our guest, as someone in my PLN for a very long time. During the time since I met him, he's risen through the ranks and he's now a head teacher, but I don't want to do his life story for him. It isn't This Is Your Life, after all. So before I start doing all that sort of thing, what I'll do is I'll bring Chris in to the studio and just say a big hello there. Hello, Chris. How you doing?
Hello. Very well, thank you. Very well. Near the end of the school year, but just wrapping things up, but all things are well. Thank you.
Good stuff, good stuff. Look, so we'll say we first met in that meeting in that quite hot room in London all those many years ago. Did you want to share a little bit about your career to date for our audience so that they know who you are, where you came from, all that sort of Cilla Black sort of thing? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I did the GTP in 2005, as I'm sure many people did the GTP, and actually trained in a school that was in special measures, which you're not supposed to do. But I somehow got in the back door and trained at a school in Woking, which was a baptism of fire, you could say. But I loved every minute of it. And I stayed at the school for 8 years. I took on, what did I do? I did this. I started as a head a year in my NQT +1 year and did 3 years of that. And at the end of that, so I took them up through year 11. And I remember absolutely bawling my eyes out when they left. I just couldn't get my head around that I was going to have to say goodbye to this group of students that had been with me under my guidance for 3 years. And then was lucky enough that an assistant head role came up at the same school, which I did for 3 years, overseeing Key Stage 4 and academic progress and a bit of the pastoral stuff as well. And then after 3 years of that, I got a deputy headship at a school in Staines, which I stayed 3.5 years or so for, and then managed to get a headship on my second interview here at Brighton Hill Community School in Basingstoke. And that was January 2017 I started here, so done about 5.5 years. So that's where we are now.
5.5 years. I mean, if you had all those years up, Chris, you don't look old enough. And I'm quite silver, so where's all the grey hair?
Well, I did find one grey hair in the beard about a week into headship, actually. I don't know if that was just coincidence, but I lost my hair years ago, so I don't need to worry about that. It keeps me looking young.
Yeah, right at the cusp of things. But another thing that is something I often spot quite a lot with you, Chris, is that you're always very dapper, and you do sport some pretty fine suits. I did notice you had a really amazing sort of proper disco suit for your recent prom at the school, but you're often seen wearing some bright yellow suits. So do you want to talk a bit about where all that sort of started and how that sort of links into what you do?
Yeah, dapper isn't the word that everyone would use, Mark. You're very kind to throwing that word in there. It started with the yellow suit, actually. My school that I'm head of has a bit of a unique selling point in the fact that they wear, as part of their uniform, bright yellow daffodil shirts. And I don't know of any other secondary schools that do so, but certainly when I started here, the students surrounded me in the quad on my second or third day, and they were very excited, not about who I was, but about the fact that I was a new head teacher, and I might be the one to get rid of the yellow shirts. They said, "Sir, you can make yourself a legend. All you need to do, just change the uniform." They said, we get called yellow bellies in the community. People take the mick out of us, and I sort of said to them, "Well, no, it's a unique selling point. We're going to keep it. It looks amazing." I'm a Watford fan as well, so that helps with the affinity towards yellow. But and it was a silly little thing. I said to them, forget yellow bellies, you're going to be the yellow army, we're going to be pride of the local area. And when you pull on that uniform, you're going to feel like you're part of something. So I had to put my money where my mouth is. And I bought a yellow suit for the prom, the first prom where I was head teacher back in summer of 2017. And it's become a bit of an expectation now. So every year I have to buy a new suit and try and be a little bit more Larry or a bit more. So, I mean, someone called the one you were talking about, Mark, which is sort of a mermaid print. Someone said it was a bit underwhelming a few weeks ago at our prom. So there's immense pressure now that is all my own fault to produce a new suit every year at the prom. So a few of them wanted me to go in a dress this year, which being a 6'4", 17 stone bloke with size 13 feet, I think I've been quite limited in the choice of dresses that might have been available to me. But it's a silly thing, but it's a big thing. Students love it, puts a smile on their faces, and it's all part of the belonging that we try and create around the yellow and the uniform, because that's a real big thing to us.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, isn't it? Because, there was that perception when you arrived at the school that yellow was a negative thing, and you flipped that into a real positive. Now, I know you're influenced quite a bit by sort of sports leaders and people who sort of think and share about leadership within sports. And actually rallying your team around you and flipping that negative into a positive is clearly something that's worked for you. Could you share a little bit about more your sort of thinking behind that, and maybe some of the people who influenced you in your thinking on that?
Yeah, so there's a few actually. In the world of football, there's this mentality that you can adopt where it sounds counterproductive, but building on the old everyone hates us, we don't care, we're going to prove people wrong type mentality. And I think Alex Ferguson used it quite well with Man United. Certainly Millwall have used it in a slightly different way, I would suggest. But one of the biggest challenges I had when I took over this school was that 2 double-decker buses were pulling up outside our school gate every morning and taking children out of the town to find better education elsewhere. And we only had 502 students on roll at the time. And I tried to build this real team spirit of, look, this is where we are. We're on a journey together to be the best in the area and beyond. If you're on board, let's see what everyone's capable of, and let's see where it leads. So the yellow thing is our badge of honour. I love the fact that our students are recognisable in the community. There was an American football coach called Bill Walsh, who, I know nothing about American football, but his leadership ideas I've taken a few tips from. And when he was manager of, I think it was the San Francisco 49ers, he had this unwritten rule that anything sporting the team's logo should be treated with the utmost respect and shouldn't be left at the bottom of lockers, shouldn't be thrown around, because that logo represents everything, all the values that the team stands for. And I wanted to build a bit of that here. So we've had a relaunch of the school logo to make it a bit more recognisable, a bit slicker, a bit clearer. We've recently relaunched not values, we call them cornerstones, that everything's built around. You can still see the initial scrawlings on the board behind me: commitment, courage, kindness, and collaboration. So everything we do comes back to those things. Again, world of sport, these things, if you've got values, then it makes decision making easier. If you come back to those 4 values, everything we're thinking about is, does it fit in with our cornerstones, and is it going to remove barriers for our students? Because our strapline, again, came from the world of sport. There's a swimmer called Adrian Morehouse in the 1980s, and he used to train at a swimming pool above which was a sign saying, this is an environment where success is inevitable. And I love that. So our strapline for the school is making success inevitable, and everything we do comes down to removing barriers, accepting that success looks different for every child who comes through our doors, but removing barriers for them so that when they leave us, they can be the most successful versions of themselves. And we've gone from 502 on roll to, in September, we'll be 1,205. So in 5 or so years, we've more than doubled the school. We've got a 255 is our plan. We've got a waiting list of 62 this year. So word has spread. You know, I don't think we're doing anything hugely world changing, but the combination of treating children well, working well with parents, trying to provide opportunities wherever we can, word spreads quite quickly. And, you know, I'm fortunate to be surrounded by a great team. And so we're a big school now, having been quite a small school. So it's been quite interesting for me because I've been able to be a head of a small school and a big school all in one headship, which is an opportunity that not everyone gets. So, so that's where, you know, the world of sport has come in. That just building that feeling of belonging. Belonging is such an important thing. And I read a book actually recently, and it's called Belonging. And it's by a guy who has done a lot of work with the All Blacks rugby team, the South African cricket team, when they're trying to embrace the diversity of the players and what different cultures bring to the same dynamic. Mm-hmm. And actually, there were some stats in there about the fact that your likelihood of surviving a cardiac arrest is dictated more by your feeling of belonging than it is by any other health factor. And I was absolutely staggered by that. And, you know, it makes sense though, doesn't it? If you feel you belong somewhere and you've got so much to live for and be part of, then there's that incentive to pull through and carry on. And for me, if our children feel like they belong and they're happy and they're safe, everything else on top of that will look after itself.
Well, that's brilliant, Chris, and congratulations on the growth of the school under your tenure. And congratulations again on such a successful career to date. It was the Pixel organisation we first met in it. You were sort of sharing advice into, and you share advice in lots of different ways. And so thank you as well for coming on to Tip Top Tips and sharing on this recording. You mentioned it's the end of the academic year. And so when we first started having this conversation about this episode, what I wanted to try and glean from you was some tips for people who are going to be moving new into SLT. You've obviously been in post as a head teacher for sort of 5 years now, but you've held other senior leadership roles. I wanted to sort of give you the opportunity to sort of share some sort of sage advice now, really, for those people who are starting their journey into school leadership, whether that's as a new sort of assistant head teacher, or maybe to somebody who's taking on their first sort of headship role. And you've already shared some great advice and some great stories about how you've sort of brought about the sense of community and the sense of belonging into the school there, Chris. One of the things I found quite difficult when I stepped up to SLT was I knew it was right to, because I could see other senior colleagues around me where I felt and I knew that I could do a better job than them, or at least I could do as good a job as them, should I say. But it didn't really hit me until I actually had the job and the role and the position that, because it's one thing knowing that you can step up, but when you have actually stepped up, when you then recognize that the buck stops with you, that's quite a sort of scary almost realization, isn't it? For those viewers that are watching and listening and who are taking that step up and moving up into a variety of different leadership roles, have you got any tips about how to sort of countenance that kind of, and imposter syndrome itself is rife in education anyway, right? Whether you're an NQT, 10 years in, first sort of department leadership role, head of year, whatever it is, right? But have you got any tips for how to sort of countenance that kind of fear, I guess, that you might be feeling on your first day, that trepidation, that you might be feeling when you sort of start in that new role?
Yeah, I mean, I do quite a lot of work with aspiring leaders, and one of the things that I always say to them is that imposter syndrome affects everyone. And I've read a book recently by John Amaechi called The Promises of Giants. And he talks about imposter syndrome and how it's a good thing because it attacks people who have a conscience, I suppose, and want to do better and want to do a good job. So if you have got imposter syndrome, it's a good thing. The problem comes when it's not handled properly or people feel that they're the only person going through it. So I'd say it's so important to have a network around you. Certainly if you get to the job of head teacher, having a network of people who are in the same position as you or are more experienced than you is completely invaluable. And certainly over the last few years where there have been some hurdles, that's been invaluable for me, having people around who might not have all the answers. And I mean, the pandemic was a massive challenge for everyone, but it reinforced the fact that someone said to me once, a guy called Jeremy Rowe, he said, you will know what to do. You just got to trust your gut feeling that you will know what to do. And there aren't really necessarily any new skills, either when you go from a head of year, head of faculty up to SLT, or when you're going through the levels of SLT up to headship. There aren't necessarily new skills. I think there's more on your shoulders as a head teacher. You feel that a bit more, and maybe you carry a few bits and pieces around with you more so than you would if your name wasn't on the sign. But also, equally, it's the greatest privilege there is to be a head teacher. And sometimes you'll catch a glimpse of your name on the sign as you'll drive in and think, wow, that's pretty cool. Or you'll think, wow, that's pretty terrifying. Because there will be things that go wrong and you'll think to yourself, okay, I wouldn't want to be dealing with that. And then you think, actually, that is my job. I better step up here. But if you surround yourself with good people, both externally in those networks and also within your team, I hear a lot of people talking about headship being lonely. I haven't found that. At all. I don't know if it's because, I have essentially over the years developed my own team and they're exceptional people. There's a great saying, surround yourself with people who are better than you. And I've certainly done that and some. And it just makes the job so much easier. I have worked in teams that weren't pulling in the same direction. I had a few years of that as a deputy head where probably my philosophy on education was very different to colleagues in the SLT, and I found that difficult, really difficult.
Mm.
But I suppose that gave me more desire to become a head teacher so that I could then set the ethos and bring in people who believed in the same ethos as me. And you mentioned about stepping up and advice on that. I was given a bit of advice on my MPQH, and the advice was choose the right school for you. And I remember thinking, stuff that. I've always wanted to be a head teacher. If a school's going to offer me a headship, I'm going to take it. It's my dream. I think part of it was I wanted to get away from the atmosphere I was working in at the time. And I went on an interview at a school in Surrey. And it was very clear that it wasn't the right school for a first headship for me. And that maybe it was a bit too far gone and that a lot of the stuff would take years to reverse. And I got to the last two and missed out to a guy who was an internal candidate. I was really bitter about it for a while. But then this opportunity came up at Brighton Hill. And when I went for a tour, it was so clear to me that it just felt like the right place. And it has proven to be so. So I have to admit that I was wrong to be so desperate for a headship that I would have taken anyone. And it's a real tough thing to do, to actually go to an interview and say that this isn't right for me and pull out of it. But I would encourage people to do that if they have a real strong feeling that it's not the right place for them. Because I suppose fate has dealt me a really good hand there in that I didn't get the role, and it's opened up something that has been much more, it's been ideal for me, really. As I've mentioned, I saw it as a big opportunity. A school that was 500 should be over 1,200, turn that around and get people on board. And here we are, still going 5.5 years later.
It's interesting you talk about that, the not getting the job, because it's really difficult when you're in a school, because you have to, as part of the process, for me at least, you kind of have to put yourself in situ. You have to put yourself in the position to see how you would fit in that school. But you're absolutely right, Chris, that, if things don't feel right, I've been in a similar position, 15 candidates at the start, you're down to the last 2, and then you don't get it, right? And that that bitterness you spoke of, that's something that I can definitely relate to. But it's funny how things do turn out sometimes, and it's difficult to see that in the moment, isn't it? When you've had to put yourself into the position, and as I was in that interview process, I didn't feel like it was quite right, but I felt that bitterness, like you shared, yeah, sometimes these things are just meant to be, aren't they, as well? And like you say, it's definitely worked out for you. Thank you for your absolute honesty on this, Chris, because, again, it's sometimes difficult to wear your heart on your sleeve with some of the conversations and things that you have and the things you experience in leadership roles. And I guess that's why sometimes people do experience what you shared then a moment ago about feeling lonely in headship.
Yeah, So just on that, Mark, I try and say to people, it's our duty as heads to talk up headship, because there is a shortage of good heads. And I cringe quite a lot on Twitter, because, as you know, I'm a big fan of Twitter most of the time. But when I see heads on there, either talking about how exhausted they are, and, I get it, but that I don't know if that's the right platform to do it. Firstly, if I were a parent, well, I am a parent, but if my child's head teacher was constantly talking about how tired they are, how much they hate the job, that would be a bit of a concern for me. And also, aspiring heads, we don't want them to see that sort of thing. And so I try to be universally positive about my role. None of it's fake. I genuinely love doing the job. But equally in school as well, I'm very acutely aware that I've got double figures of staff in my school who are more than good enough to become head teachers someday. And I think it's my responsibility to show them that the job is doable and that you can thrive while doing it. And it drives me mad when you see heads walking around their own school saying, "Oh, so busy, got this meeting," and staff say, "Oh, yeah, it must be really difficult." And what I tend to say to people, or try to say to people, is actually no more difficult than your job. I don't know if I could go back to doing 26 lessons a week, for example, and I take my hat off to people who do that. But anyone in the school, everyone's working at their very best. And I think as heads, what we've got to do is talk up the job. Don't try and have this martyr-like attitude of, "Oh, it's so difficult, but I'm putting myself through it for the goodness of my community," because it'll put people off, and we don't want to put people off. We've got to talk up headship because it's the best job there is.
Well, I'm not going to say anything different to that, Chris. Thanks for bigging up headship there. And education, full stop. I think, education is definitely the best profession in the world to be involved in. So preaching to the choir here, Chris, on that.
I know.
You did mention the P word, parents. And I do feel for the head teachers and teachers of my children when they must find out that I'm their parent sometimes. Because I do have to have some conversations which are let's say I would not necessarily want to be on the receiving end of some of those conversations myself. Let's say, look, as the head, Chris, you must have had some quite interesting conversations with parents. I'm sure I may well be seen as a difficult parent at times. Really, like you as a parent, I just want the best for my kids, really. And so the difficult conversations are part of the job. Sometimes that's with parents, sometimes that's with with colleagues who may need some extra support and those sort of things as well. I always remember a head that at one school I worked in, he always talked about the importance of positive relationships and mutual respect, whether you're meeting and greeting a kid on the front gate on their first day, or whether you're having to escort them out on a permanent exclusion. That those same values should run through like a stick of rocks. So I've got a question for you, Chris. How do you deal with those sort of difficult conversations, be it with parents, colleagues, or anyone else in between? How do you manage all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the more challenging parts of the job. Sometimes you hear people say, "Oh, yeah, I love having those really difficult conversations." And my first thought is, if you're someone who loves having those conversations, you probably shouldn't be having them, because they're not enjoyable. And if you're finding them enjoyable, then the other person probably isn't, and you're not going to get to any sort of resolution. So it is really difficult. I think, I worked in sales for 5 years before I got into teaching, and we had a lot of training on dealing with difficult customers, and I brought some of that with me because it's not that different. But you mentioned it there, Mark, about wanting the best for your child. And when it comes to difficult parents, you've got to try and put yourself in their shoes and understand that they're possibly being potentially difficult because they want the best for their child. And I think most of the battle is convincing them that we're all on the same side. And there are occasions where, and the recent SEN Green Paper talked about it, that schools and parents are at loggerheads, but it's nothing to do with either. It's actually the system that both are angry at, and it just happens that they're the ones that come to blows, figuratively speaking, of course. So I think trying to show empathy wherever possible, but also you have to draw a line. And I think this great head, Vic Goddard, who often I think it's him who's used the phrase, "Don't confuse my kindness for weakness." And actually, one of the most successful things we've done at our school is relaunch the behaviour system with much higher expectations and actually requiring a lot more buy-in from parents with regards to them accepting why we're doing certain things. And it has absolutely transformed the school. There are no loopholes. One of the things that I learned from staff when I started, because I spoke to every member of staff in my first 60 days, the thing that kept coming back was that they'd, for example, set a detention and the parent would go and shout at the head teacher and the head teacher would reverse it. And it would totally undermine them. So we make a promise to staff that, you follow our school behaviour policy, we will back you 100%, absolutely no questions. So there are times where you do have to stand up to difficult parents who don't like what you're doing and just explain to them that we're a happier, safer community because of the systems we put in place. We need you to buy into it. And if you can't, we've got nowhere to go. Because too often, I think, in schools, staff well-being is being negatively impacted because of behaviour and not getting that support from SLT and the head. And I have lots of requests for visits to come and have a look at the school since we got a very positive Ofsted and before, actually, which is lovely. But I always say make sure the head comes along, because if you want to do something with behaviour, the head has to buy in. The head has to support it and be prepared to have those difficult conversations where holding the line is what you need to do to ensure the integrity of everything you're doing. So difficult conversations do come with the job, but you've got to try and take emotion out of it and just reassure parents that what we're doing is for the sake of the children. And it's the same with staff. If you come to any conversation about staff performance, staff conduct, if you come into that conversation with the children in mind, are the children getting the best deal? Would I want my children to be in this class? Then it becomes a lot easier, and you can't have any comeback on that, really, can you? If you live and breathe our cornerstones or our strapline, making success inevitable, we've all just got to get on board with it. So yeah, there are a few hairy moments, but good character.
Great stuff. Thanks for sharing that advice there, Chris, and lots of sort of takeaways for our audience there. I'm mindful of time. I've got a few more questions lined up for you. I wanted to ask you a popular question people often get when they're actually on interview is about like their first 60 days and what they'd like to try and do in their first 60 days. Now that for our viewers, given we're trying to share advice for those new to post, ready for the sort of September start, those sorts of things, putting what they said in their interview to one side, because an answer on an interview is often sometimes a bit different to reality. What advice would you give to someone new to the role within a leadership team, be it assistant head or head teacher or anywhere in between, to try and achieve during their first sort of 60 days in their post?
I think the most important thing is just to listen to people. Just listen to everyone you can. Speak to students, speak to staff, speak to governors, speak to parents, and just hear. It's a great opportunity because in those first 2 months, it's a bit of a honeymoon period, because whatever negative stuff people say to you, you don't need to take that personally, because none of it is your own doing. And I quite enjoyed that little honeymoon period whereby I was able to say to people, just be honest, tell me everything, warts and all, and we'll try and make it better. And people love to hear that. I think that the key, what I try to do, rather than, and this is from sport as well, from Dave Brailsford, is rather than just say to people what's wrong, I invited people to share marginal gains with me, whereby they come up with ideas of something that could change something by 1%, and all those ideas together can add up to something massive. So rather than say, okay, tell me what's up, I ask people to bring ideas for marginal gains that we could bring in nice and quickly, nice and easy. So 2 that sprung to mind in my first 60 days. Firstly, the feedback policy was every single piece of work in every book needs to be marked at all times. So we scrapped that immediately. That was a real big win. So we reduced that enormously. And secondly, I had people who said that they'd come back from taking their child to hospital, for example, to a letter saying this will be unpaid leave. And I couldn't get my head around that. So we brought in dependency days. So staff 3 days a year to start with, where if they need to be with a dependent, doesn't have to be a child, could be an elderly relative. If you need to be with them, you go and be with them. No questions asked, fully paid. And I think little things like that people can see that you're acting on what they've said needs to be improved. And, giving, lots of people don't even use the 3 days, but giving people the possibility to use them should they need them is really powerful. And you get so much more back in loyalty from doing something like that. And actually, if we didn't do it, you'd be rewarding the dishonest ones who just ring in sick, and you're actually punishing the honest ones who ring in and say, oh, got to take my child to hospital. Absolute nonsense. So 2 little examples there that came about just from listening to people. Difficult parents, you can get them on side early doors. I remember meeting with 4 parents from year 9 in my first month. And I said to them, if you want to help me change it, we've got parent governor posts available. And one of them took me up on it, became governor, and was part of the solution. So listening to people and taking action based on what they've said is the absolute key for those early days, I would say.
Great stuff, brilliant answer. And you kind of sort of stole my follow-up answer, because it was, so you get this information, so how do you then go about acting on it? But then you gave some great examples of how you then acted on it. So thanks for sharing that, Chris. I wanted to ask you a question about tenure. And how long you should stay in post. Now, this may be, you may want to give me 2 answers for this based upon people who want to sort of move on in their career through the ranks by starting new to leadership as an assistant head versus someone who's taking on a role as a head, because, we see an awful lot of sort of football. You mentioned football a bit already, but we do see quite a bit of football manager syndrome, don't we, in schools, with people expecting quick changes and quick wins and these sort of things, when actually a lot of these things do take an awful amount of time. But approach it however you will in your response, Chris. But in terms of tenure, how long should, do you think, somebody sort of think about staying in a post once they've taken it up within a school?
Yeah, I think what the mistake people tend to make is when they put a number of years, for example, on how long you should be somewhere. I've always said that if you feel ready and you're confident enough to go for a role, even if you've only done a year as an assistant head, I mean, what's stopping you becoming a deputy head? Very, very little, I would suggest. It's a slightly different role, but skills-wise, not a huge amount. So don't be afraid to be bullish when it comes to wanting to climb the ladder. Equally, don't wish it away too quickly, because there are some roles that are great to do over a longer period of time. I really do miss the head year role, as I mentioned before, but it's felt like the right time to move up because I've taken them through to year 11. When it comes to headship, I think or deputy headship, it all depends on how satisfied you feel in your role, how supported you are, what people you have around you. I've got an incredible leadership team. I've got incredible governors. We're growing as a school. We've still got unfinished business. There's no limit to where I want to take my school. So the idea of me moving at this stage is not even in my thought process at the moment. Obviously, things could change over the years, but I think you've just got to trust your gut. And if things are going well, you're enjoying where you are, and you still feel that challenge of wanting to improve, then keep going as long as you can.
Great stuff. I think you're absolutely right, actually. There's a lot to be said as well about unfinished business, feeling like you're at the right time. And sometimes you may feel like the grass is greener elsewhere, but actually it's often important to reflect upon where you're at and the opportunities of the people that are around you as well. I've been in some fantastic schools where I felt like I should be progressing, but actually, do I miss out? Am I missing out on other opportunities to develop myself, grow more, all these things by moving on from the role that I'm in with the people that I'm surrounded by as well? So, yeah, lots of great advice. I think that final point there, Chris, about sort of following your gut is absolutely key. And it goes back to that quote you shared before about there are no sort of real new things. When these things happen, you're presented with problems that you don't necessarily know the answer to. And go with your gut, because chances are probably actually if you're guided by the right sort of vision and values like you've got on the board behind you on your cornerstones, then you probably won't fall far from where you should be anyway, will you?
Yeah, you'd hope not. No, you'd hope not. But I suppose people lose sight of that sometimes. And, loyalty works both ways, doesn't it? And I think if you feel valued and you've got a team of governors above you who value you and want to support you, or as an assistant head, deputy head, if you've got a head who values you and wants to support you, then you're in a good place. I think the difficulty comes when maybe as a head teacher the governors aren't supportive or have very strange views on education that maybe don't fit yours. I think there's no shame in accepting that it's not the right place for you to continue to thrive, and moving to another school isn't a crime. It's sometimes the best for everyone involved, but I think the more I speak to head teachers, the more I think a strong team of governors and governors that will support you is incredibly important for happiness in your role.
No, I completely agree there, Chris. Thank you. I'm mindful that we're going a bit longer than we would otherwise go, but so many great nuggets there for the recording. So thank you so much for that, Chris. I'm going to wrap things up now with one final little question. I'm not going to drop you in the deep end about your true feelings about technology and education, but as you know with me, I'm a big fan of technology and education, and it can be really, really helpful to people in any role within education. So I wanted to ask you as a final question, really, what tool do you find as a head teacher actually helps you the most to do your job? And it might be actually, given your comments about David Brailsford before about marginal gains, it might be actually a few little things that cumulatively, actually, when you aggregate them, turn into a big win, perhaps. I don't know. But I wanted to sort of wrap up with a little technology question, if that's all right, because I couldn't help myself. What technology, you know me, what EdTech tool do you find most useful in helping you do your job, Chris?
Well, I suppose the biggest one, and it's not a very original answer, is it? But Microsoft Teams has served us incredibly well over the course of the lockdowns and the pandemic in general. I think my biggest fear when we had to close the gates was losing that feeling of belonging and actually coming back and having to rebuild from nothing. So Teams really allowed us to keep that feeling of belonging. It was never going to be the same. But actually having individual groups and having an online forum was absolutely brilliant for us and has served us really well. My problem is, Mark, when I see something brilliant, I just want to use it, but we can never work out how to use it. So even this technology you're using today, I want it, and we'll try and have a play with it and try and get it to work. But there is a danger of just throwing too many things in at once. I do like using Prezi for presentations. I think it looks a lot slicker than PowerPoint when you're doing maybe an open evening talk or something like that. We use a tool called Performance Learning, which has been really good for us, where it's an online questionnaire for students linked to wellbeing and nutrition and sleep and that sort of thing, where we can harvest some really rich data for students. Sentry Tech has been great for us with the artificial intelligence, assesses where gaps in learning are occurring and sending students stuff to help them with those gaps. So there's we've got a few, and we've got a few internal systems as well that have been created by some geniuses who work here. We've got an online progress tool which essentially brings all of students' information together, addresses where the issues are, and links to a list of interventions that can be used for certain areas. So that's helped. So a bit of everything, Mark, as you'd expect me to answer. A bit of everything, but always on the lookout for more things that will help remove barriers to make success inevitable for our students.
Great stuff, and lovely to end that with the comment, bringing it straight back to the students in the school as well. Anyone would think you had a focus on belonging, Chris. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and share and chat with me today. I know you're very, very busy and must be very tired at the end of the academic year as well. But I know the advice you've shared will be of great interest and relevance to those people stepping up. And I can't wait to get this episode out and shared with people. If you do want to follow Chris on social media, right throughout this episode, you've been seeing the little ticker across the bottom there. I'm trying to get it right way there. Chris Edwards UK on Twitter. Please do reach out. He's one of the good ones and will always respond. And if you can't answer a question, sort of recommend a few people who probably can and those sort of things as well. He is a good sort, as you probably gathered from this conversation today. So as Stephen say, thank you, Chris, again for joining me for this chat. Thank you to you too for viewing, and we'll catch you on the next episodes of Tip Top Tips Edu from NetSupport. Thanks for joining us. Take care, everybody. Keep safe out there and enjoy your summer break. Thanks.
Thank you.